It is November 17th, 2024, and Joseph Robinette Biden has apparently decided to end his one and only term by setting the U.S. up for direct war with Russia. At least that's according to several reports today, which include the New York Times and the Associated Press. So let's get into what is being said. And just a quick note here, we have a new episode of my exclusive series for paid subscribers called Sanction out today. And in that episode, we take a look at the recent reports coming from the UN Special Committee to investigate Israeli practices as they look at Israel's war crimes over the last year and determine that Israel is committing genocide of the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. But that's not the only report, because Human Rights Watch also has a report out documenting Israel's ethnic cleansing in the Gaza Strip. And all of this comes as I know that we have an incoming Trump administration in which Trump's cabinet members are more zealous than ever about their support for Israel, more aggressive than ever, right? They're not even playing the game of the two-state solution where they act as though they really want to see a Palestinian state one day. No, they're coming in and talking about annexation and essentially the eradication of Palestinians from their land altogether. So we get into all of this, the current reports that we're seeing, the timing of it all, and what it means for where we're headed. So if you want to check out that episode and others, this is episode 10, so you've got nearly a dozen episodes to watch. If you haven't signed up as a paid subscriber, you can check out the latest from my series called Sanction over on my page on Substack. That's rachelblevins.substack.com. You can also find it on my page on Patreon. That's patreon.com/rachelblevins. Now back to the video. Now, first and foremost, all publications seem to be citing anonymous sources within the Biden administration as of the time of this recording. The New York Times on Sunday noted, with just 2 months left in office, President Biden has authorized the first use of U.S.-supplied long-range missiles by Ukraine for strikes inside Russia. They also claimed that allowing the Ukrainians to use the long-range missiles, known as the Army Tactical Missile Systems, or ATACMS for short, came in response to Russia's surprise decision to bring North Korean troops into the fight. Now, just a note here, because I still have not seen evidence of North Korean troops fighting alongside Russian forces in Russia's Kursk region, but it is interesting to note the ways in which the mainstream media here in the West have been repeating this claim over and over again for weeks, to the point where now they have all just accepted it as fact without, again, presenting a single shred of evidence. The AP said about the same thing in their report, also giving the justification of alleged North Korean troops fighting with the Russians against the Ukrainian incursion into Russia's Kursk region for why the US would allow the restrictions to be lifted at all. Which is interesting, because the last time that I checked, the US was not at war with North Korea. So why should they care if there are North Korean troops inside Russia? After all, Moscow and Pyongyang also have a treaty between the two of them that allows for mutual defense. But again, we don't know how many, if any, North Korean troops are within Russia, if they're training, if they're on any kind of front lines. And quite frankly, that is none of Washington's business. Oh, so they're concerned that, their Ukrainian buddies are going to be hit allegedly by these troops in Russia's Kursk region? Well, maybe they shouldn't have gone in there to begin with. But let's get back to the significance of this decision, if it is the decision that was made. We know that Biden has just 2 months left in office. And I thought it was interesting because both the reports from the New York Times and from the AP noted the fact that this decision wasn't just made overnight, that this topic has been hotly debated within NATO for months now. You've had Zelensky calling for these restrictions on ATACMS to be lifted, and you've had the West in this position of saying, no, not yet, any variety of those things, because they know the consequences. They know that this sets the US or whatever Western country is involved up for direct war against Russia, because they would be directly involved in those attacks. And it's interesting because when it comes to those within the NATO alliance who are reportedly in favor of lifting the restrictions, they all bring up this claim that it would be a game changer, right? It's all about some sort of a game changer. But in reality, there hasn't been and does not seem to be any sort of game changer for the NATO alliance in this war it picked with Russia that it cannot win. Now, speaking of just how involved the US is in, say, a long range strike against Russia that is being launched, quote unquote, by Kiev, it's really being launched by the US. Let's just be honest about that here. The US is directly involved in everything from choosing the coordinates to implementing the coordinates to launching and carrying out the actual attack. So, acting as though this is something that Kiev is doing on its own is simply dishonest. And that's why Russian President Putin has repeatedly warned against it while noting that, again, Moscow is well aware of just how involved the West would be in these attacks. Back in September, Putin declared that Moscow would treat any such attacks as a direct attack by the countries that supplied the weapon. Then in October, he doubled down and said he hoped NATO heard his warning. Well, if they did hear it, they clearly weren't listening. And it's so interesting to me that the US always loves to play the victim here, right? They act as if they just don't understand how Russia would be taking such a hard line here when you're literally talking about attacks directly inside Russian territory. Why Russia would feel targeted when the West has already taken several steps to attack it, which include making it the most sanctioned nation in the world. But when it comes to the question of how Russia could and arguably would respond, they have thousands of options, and hundreds of those options can be found in the nearly 800 military bases that the US has all around the world. See, back in 2021, Al Jazeera estimated that the US had around 750 military bases in at least 80 countries with around 173,000 troops deployed in 159 countries. Now, those numbers have likely fluctuated a bit, especially in the last year, as the US has ramped up its military presence around the Middle East in support of Israel and their genocide. But those bases, and more importantly, those troops, are literally just sitting ducks that Russia could attack 7 ways to Sunday if it wanted to. And if it did, then it would be able to point to the US and say, you attacked us first. You started this. Now, what's also notable here is that we have all of these reports swirling around, right? We have multiple different publications here in the US saying that they have anonymous sources, that they have confirmed that the Biden administration has lifted the restrictions. Now, we notably, as of the time of this recording, have not heard anything from the White House. They have yet to confirm, deny, or comment on it. But we did get a comment from Zelensky over in Kiev as he released a video address on Sunday evening. And in it, he said, quote, "The plan to strengthen Ukraine is the victory plan, which I presented to our partners. One of its key points is long-range capabilities for our army. Today, there's a lot of talk in the media about us receiving permission for respective actions, but strikes are not carried out with words. Such things are not announced. Missiles will speak for themselves." So even Zelensky himself doesn't directly confirm it, but this is exactly and would be exactly what he has been asking for, begging for, and demanding from the West for months now. It's part of his so-called victory plan, which isn't really about victory at all. It's actually more about dragging the West, or NATO in particular, into a direct war against Russia in every possible way that they can, including with lifting those restrictions, yes, but also on top of that, taking it a step further and trying to push Ukraine into becoming a NATO member, which would literally put the entire alliance at war with Russia immediately, thanks to Article 5. The timing is also notable here because while, yes, you have Biden trying to hold on to this war, it is his baby, it is his legacy. I guess not exactly a victorious legacy, but that doesn't change how Biden, or I guess his team, sees it. But as you have them trying to hold on to this war, you have the US just electing a president who is saying that as soon as he gets into office come January, that he is going to end the war in Ukraine. Although I will still note that he claimed he would end it as president-elect, but anyways. So you have all of that happening here in the US, but you also have the fact that last week, Russian President Putin and German Chancellor Olaf Scholz held a phone call for the first time in nearly 2 years. And that's a big deal. Now, ironically, Scholz didn't sound too happy about how this call went, as he was quoted as saying that the conversation was very detailed, but contributed to a recognition that little has changed in the Russian president's views of the war, and that's not good news. Essentially, it sounds like Putin got on the phone and noted that, hey, his demands are well known. He's mentioned them multiple times and they have not changed. And if you know anything about the Russian president, if you paid attention to any of his speeches, that shouldn't come as a surprise, right? I would not expect him to get on the phone with someone like Olaf Scholz, who has the personality of a wet noodle, and to suddenly beg for his forgiveness and say, let's make a deal. Ukraine can have whatever it wants. That's just not going to happen, no matter how many fantasies Olaf Scholz and even Zelensky have about it. And while no, there weren't any kind of breakthroughs on this call, what it did was it cemented the fact to the West that Russia is well aware that it is winning this war and that it's not going to agree to some deal just because the West is suddenly wanting to talk or wanting to get together and form some sort of peace agreement. No, Russia's not going to agree to that, especially not when, again, it's winning this war. So it's clear to me that the Biden administration is not happy that Olaf Scholz would even dare to talk to Putin on the phone, for there to be any sort of dialogue whatsoever, right? God forbid Scholz come back and say something like, Putin actually sounded kind of logical on that phone. I know he wouldn't, but still, there's always a chance for that as long as they're having dialogue. But it's also a reminder to all of us that the U.S. does not want this war to end. And by the U.S., I mean the U.S. establishment, which does include the Biden administration and really surrounds it at this point, right? They're probably looking at Germany, I would guess, and saying, did you not get enough of a warning with the attacks on the Nord Stream pipelines? Was that not enough to keep you in line? Because apparently it wasn't enough. And if it is true that the Biden administration did move to lift these restrictions on Kiev's use, really Washington's use of long-range missiles to target Russian territory, then it would be sending a message to the entire world, but more specifically to Germany, that the US still sees itself as being totally and fully in control, and that there will be no dialogue with Russia for as long as the US establishment has a say. But the craziest part to me here is that, okay, let's say that the Biden administration did lift these restrictions, right? It did give Kiev free rein. It said, all right, let's get together. Let's launch long-range missiles into Russia. Is that going to be a game changer? No. Is that going to help Kiev, quote unquote, win this war? Also, no, it's not going to stop Russian forces from advancing in the Donbass region, which they are doing right now. It's not going to help out Kiev's forces on the front lines. It's not going to bring back any manpower that they've lost. It is going to do nothing in the grand scheme of things for what Zelensky claims that his goals are in, quote unquote, winning this war, as if that were a possibility. No, it's just going to terrorize the Russian population, which I would argue is the exact purpose of why they're doing it. It's yet another distraction, but it has nothing to do with peace or victory at the end of the day. Because right now, the US establishment is dealing with the fact that in 2 months, the President of the United States is going to be someone who campaigned on the promise of ending the war in Ukraine. Now, I have been very outspoken about my doubts about what Trump would actually be able to accomplish, but the fact is that he has said that he wants to end it. The American people have said that they want to end U.S. involvement in the war in Ukraine. And that's something that the U.S. establishment cannot have happen, at least not without a fight, and not till they have another money laundering country set aside to put all of their support into. So as long as that is the case, right, they have to make it so that the US gets more and more involved in this war to the point where it won't be so easy for it to just pull out and be done with it. It reminds me of a famous quote from George Orwell, in which he once said that the war is not meant to be won, or in this case, lost. It is meant to be continuous. And that's something everyone should be talking about. If anything in this video resonated with you, be sure to like it, share it with your friends, leave a comment, and as always, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to keep up with all of my work, make sure that you're subscribed to my page on Substack. That's rachelblevins.substack.com. That's where you can find new weekly episodes of my exclusive series for paid subscribers called Sanction, and we have a new episode out today. You can also find Sanction over on my page on Patreon. That's patreon.com/Rachel Blevins. As always, thank you all so much for all of your support, and I'll see you next time.